In the days of the judges, when Israel had no king and each tribe survived as best it could, the people fell under the yoke of Jabin, king of Canaan, for 20 long years. His army was commanded by a feared general throughout the region, a man named Sisera, who possessed 900 iron chariots capable of crushing any Israelite resistance. At that time, a woman named Deborah ruled as judge, a prophetess who sat under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel to administer justice to the people of Israel. Deborah sent for a man named Barak and commanded him on God's behalf to gather 10,000 men to face Sisera's army near Mount Tabor. Barak, however, refused to march into battle unless Deborah personally accompanied him, revealing a hesitation that would shape the rest of the story. Deborah agreed to go with him, but warned him of something that would change the course of the narrative. The glory of that battle would not belong to Barak, but to a woman. No one at that moment imagined that woman would not be the warrior prophetess herself, but someone completely removed from the battlefield, a simple dweller of a tent. When the Israelite army came down from Mount Tabor, the Lord threw Sisera's troops into confusion, and his iron chariots became stuck in the mud of the Kishon River. The battle turned into a total massacre for the Canaanites, and Sisera, seeing that everything was lost, abandoned his chariot and fled on foot to save his life. He ran for hours, exhausted and terrified, until he saw in the distance the tents of a man named Heber the Kenite, who maintained a peaceful alliance with King Jabin. Sisera thought that there, among the allied Kenites, he would be completely safe from his Israelite pursuers, unaware that this decision would seal his fate in the most brutal way. At the entrance of one of the tents appeared a woman named Jael, wife of Heber, who welcomed him with reassuring words and a hospitality that seemed genuine. She told him to come in without fear, and Sisera, completely trusting, took refuge inside the tent, believing no law of war would allow him to be harmed there. Jael covered him with a blanket to protect him from the cold, and when the general asked for a little water to quench his thirst, she offered him something better. She gave him milk from a skin, a gesture that in the culture of the time represented a sacred commitment of protection toward the guest receiving that food. Sisera, exhausted from his flight and the battle, asked Jael to guard the entrance of the tent and deny his presence if anyone came asking for him. Trusting in the protection he believed he had secured, Sisera fell into a deep sleep, overcome by the extreme exhaustion of having run for miles escaping death. It was then that Jael made a decision that would break every rule of hospitality of her time and would turn her into one of the most debated figures in the Bible. She took one of the pegs used to hold down the camp's tents, along with a heavy mallet normally used to drive them into the ground. She crept quietly toward the sleeping general, placed the sharp point of the peg against his temple, and with all her strength struck it again and again. The peg pierced Sisera's temple and drove deep into the ground beneath him, killing him instantly while he slept, with no chance whatsoever to defend himself. Shortly after, Barak arrived pursuing Sisera, and Jael came out to meet him, to show him that the man he was looking for was already dead inside her tent. Upon entering, Barak found the general's body with the peg still driven through his head, confirming in the most literal way possible the prophecy Deborah had given. The glory of the victory, just as had been foretold, did not belong to Barak, but to a woman who did not even belong to the Israelite army. Chapter 5 of Judges contains the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest preserved poems in the Hebrew Bible, which openly celebrates this act. In that song, Jael is described with extraordinary words. Most blessed of women, most blessed of tent-dwelling women, an honor reserved for very few biblical figures. The poem describes in graphic detail how Sisera asked for water and she gave him milk in a bowl fit for nobles, adding a dramatic contrast between apparent generosity and final betrayal. This poetic description, much older than the prose narrative in chapter 4, suggests the story of Jael first circulated as a song before being written down as history. Biblical scholars have debated for centuries whether Jael's act was a morally condemnable betrayal or a heroic deed justified by the circumstances of war. Heber, her husband, maintained a peace alliance with the Canaanite king Jabin, which technically made Sisera a protected guest under the tribal laws of the time. By breaking that protection, Jael did not merely kill an enemy, she directly defied the sacred customs of hospitality that governed relations between tribes of the ancient Near East. However, the biblical text never condemns her action at any point, instead presenting it as the direct fulfillment of the divine will announced by the prophetess Deborah. Some ancient Jewish commentators went so far as to compare Jael's courage to that of the great patriarchs, arguing her act saved Israel from continued Canaanite oppression. Others compared her centuries later to Judith, another woman from later Jewish tradition who also beheaded an enemy general to save her people from destruction. Jael's figure represents an uncommon pattern in the Hebrew Bible, an ordinary woman with no religious or military office who changes the course of an entire war. Unlike Deborah, who already held authority as judge and prophetess, Jael had no prior leadership role. She was simply the wife of a herdsman allied with the enemy. This makes her intervention even more surprising because she acted completely alone, with no army, no political backing, using only the objects available inside her own tent. Archaeologists who have studied Iron Age Canaanite camps confirm that tent pegs of that era were indeed sturdy tools, capable of causing fatal wounds. The mallet used to drive them into hard ground was also a common household tool, reinforcing the idea that Jael improvised her weapon with whatever was at hand. This improvisation turns the story into a tale of ingenuity and determination rather than military preparation, something that has fascinated readers for nearly 3,000 years. The fact that a woman executed the most feared general in Canaan also carried a deep symbolic meaning for an ancient audience accustomed to rigid gender roles. In the mindset of the ancient Near East, dying at the hands of a woman was considered an additional humiliation for a warrior, a detail the biblical text seems to highlight deliberately. Sisera's mother, briefly mentioned at the end of chapter 5, appears anxiously awaiting her victorious son's return, unaware he had already died at Jael's hands. This final scene adds a layer of human tragedy to the account, showing the contrast between a mother's hope and the brutal reality of her son's defeat. The Song of Deborah even mocks the ladies of Sisera's court, who imagine their general distributing spoils of war, while in reality, he lies dead in a tent. This narrative contrast between the expectation of victory and the reality of death makes chapter 5 one of the rawest and most effective pieces of ancient literature. For generations, Renaissance and Baroque artists depicted Jael in dramatic paintings, usually at the exact moment of driving the peg into the sleeping general's head. These artistic depictions, though sometimes softened for aesthetic reasons, always kept the central element of the story, a lone woman executing a powerful enemy general. Jael's story has also been analyzed through modern feminist perspectives, which interpret it as an early example of female agency within a text dominated by male figures. Other scholars prefer to focus on the theological aspect, noting that God frequently uses unexpected people with no apparent power to carry out his most decisive purposes in the Bible. This pattern repeats with Deborah herself, with Rahab the prostitute who protected the Israelite spies, and later with Esther, another woman who saves her people from a position of apparent weakness. Jael, however, stands apart from these other figures because of the direct, personal violence of her act, something not repeated in quite the same way by any other biblical heroine. The Hebrew word used to describe the strike of the peg implies a force and precision, suggesting Jael acted with absolute determination, with no hesitation or apparent regret. The text mentions no punishment for her afterward, nor any formal reward beyond the poetic recognition in the Song of Deborah and Barak. This has led some scholars to suggest that the absence of negative consequences confirms the sacred text's implicit approval of her decision to kill Sisera. The alliance between the Kenites and King Jabin, briefly mentioned at the start of chapter 4, is never explained in detail, leaving readers with questions about Heber's true loyalties. It is possible Jael acted out of a deeper loyalty toward the people of Israel, perhaps inherited from her father-in-law Jethro, the Midianite priest who had helped Moses generations earlier. This family connection to Jethro, mentioned in other passages of the Pentateuch, suggests the Kenites maintained historical ties with Israel that might explain why Jael chose to betray her husband's alliance. However, the Bible offers no explicit explanation of her inner motivations, leaving each generation of readers the task of interpreting what truly drove her final decision. This deliberate ambiguity is part of what has kept fascination with this story alive for nearly 30 centuries of reading, commentary, and constant debate among religious scholars. Jael's account also appears frequently in discussions on the ethics of ancient warfare, where the line between combatants and civilians was not always as clear as it is today. Sisera, though fleeing unarmed, remained the commander responsible for 20 years of brutal oppression over the people of Israel, which complicates any simplistic moral judgment of Jael's act. For the Israelites of that time, Sisera's death represented the end of 2 decades of suffering, abusive taxation, and subjugation under an unrelenting foreign military power. Seen from that perspective, Jael's action becomes less a treacherous murder and more the final execution of a deliverance God had already promised through Deborah. Jael's own name, meaning mountain goat in Hebrew, has been symbolically interpreted as a reference to her agility and cunning to act at the precise moment without being detected. Some medieval rabbinic commentators even speculated, without direct textual basis, about prior encounters between Jael and Sisera, though these theories belong more to legendary tradition than to the original biblical text. What the text does make clear is that the tent, traditionally a space of protection and hospitality in ancient nomadic culture, paradoxically became the deadly trap for Canaan's most feared general. This inversion of the tent's symbolism, from refuge to place of execution, is considered by many literary scholars one of the most powerful narrative turns in the entire book of Judges. The story also contrasts sharply with that of Barak, who, despite leading the victorious army, is relegated to a secondary role behind 2 women who completely dominate the account. Deborah plans the divine strategy, and Jael delivers the final blow, leaving the official military commander as an almost decorative figure within the structure of these 2 chapters. This detail is not accidental, and many see in it an implicit critique of Barak's lack of faith, who refused to act without Deborah's constant presence beside him. The biblical narrative seems to deliberately use these 2 women to underscore that divine power does not depend on conventional structures of authority or traditional military strength. Nearly 3,000 years later, Jael's story still appears in sermons, academic studies, works of art, and audiovisual productions attempting to capture the rawness and symbolism of this episode. Her story raises questions still relevant today, about the nature of just war, about the role of women in moments of crisis, and about how we interpret violence within texts considered sacred. And perhaps that is why, among all the heroines of the Old Testament, none generates as much moral debate and narrative fascination as this woman who, with only a peg and a mallet, changed the fate of an entire nation.